3 days after my dad's 60th birthday, I opened my banking app and watched $140,312 vanish to zero. The bank said he authorized it, then my family told me to calm down. What they didn't know, I had receipts, a deadline, and one call that would end the party tonight. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. My name is Renee Chapman, and I need to tell you this the way it actually felt, not the softened version people give when they want to avoid making others uncomfortable. Because 3 days after my dad's 60th birthday, I opened my banking app on a Tuesday morning at my desk in downtown Denver and watched my savings account read zero, not pending, not delayed, not temporarily unavailable, just zero, where $140,312.67 had been sitting the week before. 8 years of discipline, 8 years of skipped vacations, cheap groceries, automatic transfers, spreadsheets color-coded by month and category, 8 years of telling myself later, because I had a plan, and plans were how I stayed calm in a world that constantly felt one paycheck away from chaos. I remember staring at the screen, waiting for it to refresh, like it had made a mistake, like the app would apologize and put my life back where it belonged, but it didn't, and my hands started shaking so badly I had to set my phone down on my desk. Like it was a live wire. I work with numbers all day. I'm a data analyst. I build dashboards. I track anomalies. I find patterns. So when I tell you numbers don't lie, I mean it literally. And that zero was screaming something was wrong in a language I couldn't ignore. I walked down into the parking garage because I didn't want anyone to see my face collapse. And I called the bank, trying to keep my voice normal because a part of me still believed this was a glitch. The customer service rep was polite and calm in that way that makes you feel like you're floating alone. She confirmed the transfer, like she was reading a grocery receipt, a transfer of $140,312.67 processed yesterday. Then she said the sentence that turned my stomach to ice. It was authorized by Richard Chapman, the co-owner of the account, my father, the man who taught me to ride a bike, the man who helped with my math homework, the man who'd spent my entire life telling me family comes first. And in that moment, it felt like the ground shifted under everything I thought that phrase meant. I asked her to email the confirmation documents, and when the PDF came through, it showed my name on the electronic signature line, neat and official, like I had clicked approve and smiled while doing it, except I didn't approve anything. I didn't sign anything. I didn't even know there was a transfer until my account hit zero. And that's when the betrayal stopped being emotional and became technical, because if my name is on something I didn't sign, that's not a misunderstanding, that's forgery, that's identity theft, that's a crime with paperwork. I called my dad immediately. I didn't wait to calm down because I needed to hear his voice to confirm reality. He answered on the second ring like he was expecting me. "Renee, I was waiting for your call. Not are you okay? Not what happened, just calm anticipation, like this was overdue." I asked him why my savings account was empty, and he laughed. Actually laughed and said, "We needed it more than you, Renee. You have a stable job. You can earn it back." That sentence did something irreversible inside me, because it wasn't panic or regret. It was entitlement, like my work belonged to him, because he was my father, like my future was a family asset he could reallocate when he felt like it. I asked what he meant by we, and he sighed and said Derek was in trouble. Derek, my younger brother, the one with potential, the one who always just needed a little more support, the one who could fail publicly and still be called ambitious while I succeeded quietly and was called lucky. He told me Derek's investment fell through, that the bank was going to foreclose, and that he had to help him. I asked with my money, and he corrected me fast. Family money, like that word made theft noble. I reminded him that money was for my house, that I was making an offer the next week, and he cut me off with that calm banker voice and said, "You still can, you're smart, you'll earn it back. Derek doesn't have your advantages." And that's when I realized something horrifying. He didn't see this as harming me, he saw it as redistributing resources, because in his mind my stability made me less deserving of protection. I asked about the electronic signature, the fake consent, and there was a pause. Then he minimized, "You're overreacting. The bank needs documentation. It's procedural." And in that moment I knew he had no intention of returning anything, because people who plan to fix things don't talk like that, they talk like people who believe they're allowed. I hung up and sat in my car, staring at the steering wheel, listening to the garage ventilation hum like the building itself was breathing. And I felt sick, not just sad, sick, like my body was rejecting a truth it didn't want. Then my brain started searching for patterns, because that's what it does under stress. And a memory surfaced that made everything colder. When I was 17, my dad added his name to my bank account just in case something happens, he said. For safety, he said it. Like he was helping me, and I believed him because questioning in my family was treated like betrayal. Trust wasn't earned, it was owed. And if you didn't give it, you were ungrateful. I never removed him because why would I? He was my father, except 2 years earlier, I almost did. A bank rep asked if I wanted to change the co-owner status, and something in my gut hesitated. So I called my dad casually, and his voice went cold so fast. You don't trust your own father after everything I've done for you, and I apologized for wanting control over my own money. I left his name on the account, and that decision cost me $140,312.67. The birthday party had been the week before, early June, at my parents' house in Lakewood. Catered food, decorations, smiling relatives performing happiness. My dad gave a speech about legacy. My mom hovered proudly. Derek stood there in a blazer, introduced as an up-and-coming real estate investor, while no one mentioned his failed deals or the money I'd already given him. Relatives asked me the usual questions: still renting, no house yet, when are you getting married? And I smiled and deflected like always, because explaining yourself to people who don't actually care is exhausting. What I couldn't stop noticing was my dad and Derek whispering together, glancing at me, then looking away like they had a secret. And I was the punchline. Near the end, my Aunt Helen pulled me aside, squeezed my hand, and said, "Renee, you've given enough, be careful." And I laughed it off because I didn't want to believe it. 3 days later, my account was empty. My mom started calling nonstop, and when I finally answered, she cried and said, "You can't do this to your own father. We raised you. You'll destroy this family." And when I said he forged my signature, she went quiet, then said, "It's not stealing if it's family. And if you've ever heard that sentence, you know exactly what kind of family. This is a family where love is conditional and boundaries are treated like betrayal." I told her she had 24 hours to return the money, or I would file a police report, and she begged and prayed and told me to think about what I was doing. And for the first time, her tears didn't hook into me, they slid off, because I could see them for what they were: a tool. And right here, let me pause and ask you something, because I'm genuinely curious. Where are you watching from right now? What city or country are you in? Drop it in the comments, because these family stories land differently depending on where you grew up. And what family comes first was used to justify in your house. After that call, I did something I'd never done before. I called someone outside the family first, my friend Marcus, a lawyer who specializes in financial fraud. And when I told him everything, he said, "This is felony level serious. Joint account complicates it, but forged signature is a different category: identity theft, bank fraud." And then he tightened the timeline. "You have a 72-hour dispute window with the bank," which meant time was already bleeding away. He told me to get the metadata analyzed, and I knew exactly who to call: my coworker Carla, a digital forensics specialist. She looked at my face, didn't ask questions, and said, "Send it." 40 minutes later, she showed me the report. The signature wasn't generated from any of my devices. The IP address traced back to a residential location in Lakewood, timestamp 347 a.m. while I was asleep. "This is textbook identity theft," she said, and the paper in my hands felt heavier than paper should feel. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, opened the spreadsheet I'd kept for years, and looked at it like a crime scene. $15,000 for a roof, $28,000 for Derek's tuition, $12,000 for medical bills, $8,000 loan never repaid, another $24,000 in emergencies, over $87,000 total. And not once did anyone ask if I was okay. Not once did anyone say, "We can't keep asking." They treated my giving like an obligation, not a gift. And that's when the truth landed. My dad didn't take my savings because he panicked. He took it because he knew I had it. He knew I'd build it, and he knew I'd been trained to feel guilty for having more. He saw my future as family inventory, and I had two choices: swallow it, rebuild quietly, and let them keep the story that I'm dramatic, or stop protecting them. I opened my laptop and started filling out the police report with precision: names, dates, amounts, documentation, because when you've been a reliable one your whole life, you don't explode, you document. And as I typed, my phone buzzed with texts like, "You better not do anything stupid, and stop making this about you." And with every buzz, something inside me got calmer, because when people start yelling before you've even accused them publicly, it usually means they know exactly what they did. And by the time I hit submit, I felt something I hadn't felt since opening that banking app control. And I didn't know yet that the next thing the detective would say would turn this from a family betrayal into something that would blow up everything they thought they could hide. I walked into the Denver Police Department the next morning with a folder so thick it wouldn't close properly, and a calm I didn't recognize in myself, because once you cross a certain line, fear stops being useful and precision takes over. The detective assigned to me, Sarah Mitchell, had eyes that told me she'd seen every version of betrayal, and none of them shocked her anymore. She didn't interrupt while I explained the joint account, the forged Signature, the timeline, the spreadsheet of transfers. The way my father spoke like my money was communal property. She listened the way people do when they already know where the story is going, and when I finished she said something that made the room feel smaller. When we ran a preliminary check, something else came up. There's a personal loan opened in your name, $25,000, 6 months ago. Do you recognize it? And my mouth went dry because I had perfect credit. I monitored it obsessively. I'd never missed a payment in my life. And in that instant, the story changed shape. This wasn't a single impulsive act. This was a pattern. This was rehearsal. This was someone practicing on my identity, like it was a spare key they could use whenever it suited them. Detective Mitchell explained that identity theft within families is one of the most underreported crimes because guilt does half the criminal's job for them. Victims second-guess themselves, worry about consequences, worry about being labeled dramatic or ungrateful. And I sat there realizing my parents had relied on that silence for years. She opened a formal investigation coordinated with a bank's fraud unit and gave me a case number that felt surreal, like a barcode slapped on my childhood. On my way out, she asked if I was prepared for what might happen next, and I said yes, because at that point I was prepared for anything except pretending. This was fine. The bank froze the relevant accounts within hours. And when the fraud investigator called, he spoke softly, like he was talking to someone who just lost a loved one. He confirmed the metadata matched my parents' address, the device fingerprint didn't match any of mine, and restitution would be initiated once charges were filed. I thanked him and hung up, then sat on my couch staring at the wall because validation doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it just makes the loss undeniable. My phone exploded that afternoon. Text from my brother Derek, first angry, then pleading, then angry again. You're ruining everything. Do you know what you've done? Dad said you'd understand. Mom is hysterical. You're selfish. You've always been selfish. And reading that word selfish from the person who'd benefited most from my silence almost made me laugh, almost, because if you've ever been the dependable one, you know how upside down that accusation feels. The moment you stop giving everything is when they accuse you of taking. I didn't respond because I was done explaining reality to people who'd already rewritten it in their heads. My mother left a voicemail crying, saying, "This will kill your father. You'll destroy this family. Think about what people will say." And I realized something chilling. She wasn't asking if I was okay. She was asking me to protect the image again, to absorb the damage quietly. So the story stayed clean that night. I barely slept. My brain kept replaying moments I dismissed as normal. My dad asking casual questions about my savings balance. My mom insisting I keep my finances transparent because family shouldn't have secrets. Derek joking that I was basically his emergency fund. All of it lined up like dominoes, and the next morning something new surfaced. My Aunt Helen called me. She'd always been the quiet one, the only one who ever hinted that my generosity was an obligation. She told me my dad had been calling relatives preemptively, telling them I was unstable, that I'd misunderstood, that I was overworked and emotional, that I was making false accusations. And when she said that, a cold focus settled in, because people who rush to control the narrative know the truth won't protect them. Helen told me something else. Derek had moved into a new apartment in the Highlands, upscale, glass windows, rooftop views, expensive neighborhood. And suddenly, the missing money had an address. I looked it up. 2-bedroom, modern finishes, estimated value around $400,000. The down payment alone would have been massive, and my stomach turned. Because my father had said part went to debt, part to a fresh start, and there it was, polished, staged, celebrated. Derek posted a housewarming event on Facebook bragging about hard work and smart investing, and I watched comments roll in. Congratulations, so proud of you, inspiring stuff. And I wasn't invited, not that I expected to be, but the audacity of celebrating with stolen money felt like salt in an open wound. And right here I want to pause because I need to know something. Where are you watching from right now? What city or country? Because these family dynamics look different everywhere, but the manipulation feels universal. Drop it in the comments and keep listening, because this is where things escalated fast. The bank confirmed restitution pending criminal proceedings. Detective Mitchell called to say charges were moving forward and asked about timing for the arrest. And I told her the truth. I wanted accountability, not secrecy. I wanted the lie exposed where it lived. And she asked if I was sure, because public arrests complicate families. And I said my family complicated itself when they decided my future was expendable. The housewarming party was in 3 days. 45 guests, extended family, coworkers, friends, neighbors, all gathering to applaud my brother's success built on my stolen identity. and I thought about how many times I'd swallowed humiliation to keep the peace, how many dinners I'd smiled through while being quietly devalued, and something in me snapped into clarity. If they wanted an audience, they could have one the day of the party. I stayed home until my phone buzzed with a text from Helen. It's starting, and I imagined the scene: champagne clinking, compliments flowing, my father playing benevolent patriarch, my mother beaming, Derek soaking it up, and at exactly 7 p. And my phone buzzed again. They're here, and I knew what that meant. Sirens in the hallway, officers at the door, questions cutting through music like a blade. Helen later told me the room went silent when Detective Mitchell said, "Richard Chapman, you're under arrest for bank fraud, identity theft, and forgery." That my father tried to laugh it off until the handcuffs clicked, that my mother collapsed into tears, that Derek stood frozen, holding a champagne glass like a prop from a play that had just ended, and I wasn't there, but I could see it perfectly, because when you grow up managing other people's emotions, you get good at imagining the fallout. The calls started immediately, my brother screaming, my mother sobbing, relatives whispering, and I turned my phone off because for the first time the noise wasn't my responsibility. Later that night, I drove past the Highlands building just once. Didn't go in, just parked across the street and sat there looking at the windows lit up, thinking about how close I'd been to my own house, how easily my dream had been repurposed, and I felt grief, yes, but also relief, because the worst had already happened and surviving it meant I didn't have to be afraid of it anymore. I went home, slept for the first time in days, and when I woke up to a text from Marcus, my lawyer friend, saying the plea deal was on the table and restitution was imminent, I knew the next phase wouldn't be loud, it would be consequences, and consequences have a way of changing everything quietly, and I didn't yet know how far the fallout would spread or how much it would cost them socially, financially, emotionally, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty: the story they'd told about me was about to collapse under the weight of documented truth, and once that happens, there's no going back to pretending you didn't see it. The morning after the arrest didn't feel victorious. It felt eerily quiet, like the air after a storm when you're waiting to see what's actually been destroyed. And I woke up expecting regret to hit me like a hangover, but it didn't. What hit me instead was clarity, the kind that makes everything you used to tolerate suddenly look insane. My phone stayed off for hours because I already knew what would be there: blame, grief, bargaining, people demanding emotional labor from the person they'd just gutted. And when I finally turned it back on, there were dozens of messages. Most I didn't read because patterns repeat, and I'd already memorized this one: Marcus called first, calm, precise, the way lawyers are when the chaos belongs to someone else, and he walked me through what was happening next: charges filed, plea negotiations, likely restitution timelines. He warned me gently that families implode in stages: first shock, then anger, then revisionist history, and finally silence. And he was right, because by noon, the group text started rewriting the script. Suddenly, my father wasn't a criminal. He was a desperate man trying to save his son. Suddenly, I was cold, calculating, vindictive. Suddenly, the money wasn't stolen. It was borrowed, misunderstood, shared. The word borrowed kept appearing, like saying it enough times could turn a forged signature into consent. And I realized something uncomfortable: people weren't actually confused. They were choosing the version of the story that required the least self-reflection. If my parents were villains, then everyone who enabled them had to answer for it. So it was easier to make me the problem. I left my apartment and drove aimlessly through Denver because staying still made my thoughts too loud. I passed neighborhoods I'd once browsed on Zillow, imagining my life there, and instead of sadness, I felt resolve, because dreams deferred by betrayal don't die, they sharpen. My brother Derek emailed me a long, rambling message halfway between apology and accusation. He said he trusted Dad. He didn't know about the signature. He was under pressure. He needed a fresh start. He ended with, "You could have handled this privately." And that line stuck with me because it revealed everything. Private meant quiet. Private meant absorb. It privately meant let them keep benefiting while I disappeared. And I didn't respond because explaining boundaries to people who profit from crossing them is a waste of oxygen. By midweek, the DA confirmed the plea deal terms: probation, restitution, community service, no jail time, and I felt nothing about that too, because punishment wasn't my goal. Accountability was. The money would come back, the record would exist, the myth would crack, and the rest was no longer mine to manage. My Aunt Helen invited me over for dinner that night, and her house felt like a different universe: calm, warm, no performance. We ate pasta, and she told me stories I'd never heard about my grandmother, about how financial control ran through generations like a quiet disease. How women learn to give until they disappeared, and listening to her I understood that what I'd done wasn't just for me, it was a pattern interruption, and halfway through I want to pause again, because I'm curious, where are you watching from right now, what city, what country, what time is it, because I guarantee someone near you is living this exact story thinking they're alone. Drop it in the comments and keep going with me because the fallout didn't stop. At my parents' front door it spread outward. Like ripples, the bank restored my funds faster than expected. Seeing the balance return felt surreal, like getting back a limb you'd already mourned, but the money felt heavier now, tagged with memory. I immediately moved it into an account only I controlled and locked my credit down like Fort Knox, because trust once broken doesn't get casual access again. My workplace surprised me with compassion. My manager offered time off. HR quietly reassured me my job was safe, that I wasn't a liability, and that mattered more than I expected, because betrayal often teaches you to expect punishment for speaking up. Derek's apartment went on the market quickly. Word travels in tight investment circles, and nobody wanted to touch a property tied to fraud. Whispers followed him into rooms he couldn't escape, and watching that from a distance, I didn't feel joy, I felt inevitability, because lies need constant maintenance, and truth only needs daylight. My mother sent a letter, handwritten careful, full of scripture and selective memory. She apologized for my feelings, not her actions. She framed forgiveness as obligation and accountability as cruelty, and reading it I finally saw the manipulation clearly, how spirituality was being used as duct tape over rot. I didn't reply, because silence is sometimes the only response that doesn't reopen the wound. Weeks passed, and the noise faded. People who'd screamed the loudest went quiet when they realized there was nothing left to extract. No money, no access, no compliance, just a boundary they couldn't cross. My father completed intake for probation. My brother stopped calling relatives, stopped checking, and invitations dried up. And in that absence, I built something new. I toured houses again, this time without fear, without rushing, without anyone else's voice in my head. And I found one, not perfect, but right. And when I signed the offer, I didn't tell my family. I told Helen, I told Marcus, I told myself. The closing day was quiet, professional, my name on every page alone, and when the keys landed in my palm, I felt grounded in a way I never had, because ownership without autonomy is just another cage. The first night in the house, I slept on the floor with nothing but a blanket, and the echo felt like possibility, not loneliness. The next morning, I planted a small herb garden, because growth felt like the right metaphor, and as weeks turned into months, the story settled into something solid. My parents' reputation fractured, my brother's confidence collapsed, and my life expanded, not explosively but steadily. And I understood then that revenge isn't loud, it's alignment. It's when your life finally stops revolving around the people who try to shrink it. And if you're still here listening to this, then you already know what's coming next, because there's one confrontation, one choice, one final attempt to pull me back into the old role that changes everything. And it didn't come from the police or the courts, it came from the one person who thought blood could still override boundaries, and that moment forced me to decide what family actually means. When the last illusion finally falls, the call came on a quiet Tuesday evening, just as I was unpacking the last box in the new house, and the timing felt intentional, like the universe waiting until I finally exhaled before testing whether I meant what I'd said about boundaries. My phone buzzed with a number I hadn't saved but recognized instantly, because some numbers burn themselves into your nervous system, and when I answered, I already knew who it was. My mother's voice sounded smaller than I remembered, not weak, just reduced, like someone who had lost the audience that once amplified her authority. She didn't start with hello, she started with, your father wants to talk to you. And I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd how quickly people forget consequences once silence settles. And I told her no, and she pivoted immediately into urgency, into crisis, into the familiar script of emotional emergency, saying his probation officer needed documentation, that the family was still intact, that the stress was affecting his health, that he wasn't sleeping, that he'd lost weight, that Derek was spiraling, that everything was falling apart. And as she spoke, I realized this was the moment I'd been preparing for, not the arrest, not the restitution, not the public unraveling, but this, the attempt to pull me back into the role of stabilizer, the one who absorbs chaos so others can pretend nothing happened. And for a second, I felt the old reflex twitch, the urge to soothe, to fix, to carry. And then I looked around at the walls of a house I owned alone, at the unpacked boxes that represented a future not built on guilt. And I said calmly, I'm not available for this. And she went quiet like a line had dropped, and then she tried again, softer this time, invoking family, history, holidays, childhood memories, rewriting the past into something gentler than it was, and I interrupted her. Because interruptions are a form of self-respect, and I told her I would not speak to my father unless it was in the presence of a mediator or a lawyer, and that any communication needed to be in writing. She accused me of being cold, of changing, of letting money turn me into someone unrecognizable, and that's when it hit me that money hadn't changed me, safety had, because people who benefit from your lack of boundaries always call your boundaries betrayal, and when I hung up, my hands were steady, not shaking like they used to after these conversations, because healing isn't loud, it's regulated. The next day, a letter arrived, forwarded from my old apartment. Because some habits die hard, it was from my father, handwritten, uneven, not the confident penmanship of a banker, but the rushed scrawl of someone losing control. He didn't apologize, he explained. He framed everything as necessity, as paternal instinct, as sacrifice. He accused me of humiliating him publicly, of destroying his legacy, of poisoning the family against him, and then he wrote the line that sealed it: "After all I did for you, you owed me that money." And I sat with that sentence for a long time, because it exposed the core belief that had guided every decision he'd ever made, that love was transactional, that children were investments, that obedience was repayment. And I felt something in me close, not hardened, just close, like a door finally locking, and I didn't respond. I forwarded it to my attorney and archived it, because engagement is oxygen, and I wasn't feeding the fire. Weeks later, Derek showed up unannounced at my door, which was bold considering I'd given him my boundaries in plain language. He looked worse than I'd ever seen him, unshaven, eyes hollow, posture slumped like gravity had increased. And he didn't wait for an invitation. He just started talking, saying Dad was blaming him, Mom was depressed, friends had vanished, work was impossible, that he felt like he'd lost everything. And I listened, because listening doesn't mean agreeing. And when he finally paused, expecting comfort, I asked him a single question: did you ever once think about how this would affect me? And he didn't answer, because silence is an answer. And I told him that until he could acknowledge his role not as a victim, but as a participant, there was nothing to discuss. He accused me of being self-righteous, of enjoying my moral high ground. And I told him accountability feels like punishment when you've never practiced it. And then I closed the door and leaned against it, not in despair, but in relief, because choosing yourself doesn't feel triumphant, it feels quiet and heavy. And right somewhere around this point, I want to ask you, where are you watching from right now? What city, what country, what time is it? Because stories like this travel far, and I want to know how far this one is reaching. Drop it in the comments and keep going, because the real shift didn't come from cutting them off, it came from what replaced them. I started building a life that didn't require permission, dinners with friends who asked how I was and waited for the answer, mornings without dread, holidays redefined on my own terms, therapy sessions where I unpacked the years of subtle conditioning that taught me love equaled sacrifice and sacrifice equaled worth. And the more I unpacked, the clearer it became that my parents hadn't just taken money, they'd taken time, confidence, safety, and naming that loss allowed me to grieve properly, not the fantasy of who they could have been, but the reality of who they were. And as I healed, the messages slowed, then stopped. My mother retreated into silence, my father complied with probation, my brother drifted, and the family narrative fractured into those who accepted reality and those who clung to denial. And in that separation, I found peace, not because I won, but because I stopped playing a game rigged against me. And just when I thought the chapter was closing, another message arrived, this one from an extended relative, someone I barely knew, asking if the rumors were true, if I really called the police on my own father. And I replied yes, and waited. And when they didn't respond, I felt no urge to explain, because clarity doesn't need consensus. And as the seasons changed, so did I, stronger, quieter, more selective with my energy. And that's when I realized the final reckoning wasn't about them at all. It was about me deciding who gets access to my life and under what conditions. And there was one last decision, one final test of that resolve approaching, not from my family, but from an unexpected place that forced me to confront whether I truly believed I deserved the peace I'd built, or if part of me was still waiting to be punished for choosing myself. The unexpected place came disguised as opportunity, which is always how the most dangerous tests arrive, because growth doesn't get challenged by obvious threats, it gets challenged by things that look like rewards. And mine showed up as an email from a senior executive at Datasphere, someone I barely interacted with, but whose name carried weight. The subject line read Leadership Pathway Conversation, and for a split second my stomach dropped because for years advancement had been the thing I postponed. I was too busy being the reliable daughter, the financial backstop, the emotional glue, and now that I finally had space, the universe decided to see whether I'd fill it wisely or hand it back out of habit. The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon, and all week I felt the old tension creep in the voice that said, "Be agreeable, don't rock the boat, prove your worth, earn your place." I sat across from him in a glass conference room overlooking downtown Denver, the city buzzing below, like a reminder that life keeps moving whether you claim it or not. He spoke about visibility, about leadership, about sacrifice. He talked about how the role would require flexibility, late nights, travel, sudden pivots. And then he said the sentence that made my chest tighten: "We need someone who can be fully available, someone without too many external complications." And he smiled like he was offering me clarity, not a warning. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't about my parents at all. It was about the pattern I'd been taught, that my value increased the more I erased myself. And I thought about the house, the garden, the quiet mornings, the boundaries I'd built. And I asked a question I'd never asked before: what kind of support does the company offer for work-life balance? His smile faltered just a fraction, and he pivoted back to ambition, to growth, to opportunity, and I nodded politely and left without agreeing to anything, because I was finally learning that not every open door leads somewhere you want to go. That night I sat on my porch watching the sun drop behind the trees, the air cooling, the world slowing, and my phone buzzed with a message from my mother, a single line: "I don't recognize you anymore." And I typed back, "I finally recognized myself," and didn't send it because some truths are for you, not them. Instead, I archived the message and went inside and slept better than I had in years. The following weeks were quiet, almost suspiciously so, and quiet can be unsettling when you're used to chaos, but I filled it deliberately: dinners with friends, therapy sessions, long walks in neighborhoods where no one knew my last name. And then one afternoon I received a call from a number I didn't recognize, and something told me to answer. It was a woman named Karen who introduced herself as a financial counselor working with families navigating legal restitution and compliance. She was assigned to monitor my father's payments, and she wanted to confirm my preferred method of communication. She spoke professionally neutrally, but then she said something that lingered after situations like this: families often try to reconnect. Are you prepared for that? And I said yes, because preparation doesn't mean fear, it means clarity. And as if summoned by the question, Derek emailed again, this time longer, more emotional, less defensive. He wrote about therapy, about regret, about realizing how much he'd taken for granted. He didn't ask for money, he asked for forgiveness. And I read it slowly, carefully, noticing the absence of accountability phrases, the subtle positioning of himself as a victim of circumstance. And I realized growth isn't declared, it's demonstrated. And I replied with boundaries, not bridges, telling him I was glad he was seeking help, and that forgiveness was a process, not a transaction, and that I wasn't ready to engage further. And when I sent it, my hands didn't shake, which felt like progress. Around this point, I want to pause again and ask you, where are you watching from right now? Because stories like this don't just belong to one person, they echo across families, across cultures, across cities. So drop your location in the comments and stay with me, because the next shift didn't come from my family or my job, it came from within when I started volunteering with a local financial literacy nonprofit, teaching young adults how to protect their credit, set boundaries, understand joint accounts, the things no one teaches you until it's too late. And during one session, a young woman raised her hand and said, "My mom says, if I don't co-sign, I'm selfish." And something cracked open in me, not pain, recognition. And I told her the truth, that love doesn't require financial harm, that guilt isn't a contract. And watching her write that down felt like closing a loop. Healing doesn't just come from cutting people off, it comes from interrupting patterns. And then one evening months later, a letter arrived, not from my parents, but from the bank, a notice of final compliance. My father had completed restitution, probation satisfied, case closed. And I sat with that finality longer than I expected, because closure isn't relief, it's acceptance. And as I folded the letter, I felt something settle. The story was over, but the impact wasn't. And then my mother showed up again, this time not with guilt or urgency, but with silence. She sent a card, no message, just her handwriting, and I held it, knowing this was her way of testing whether access had reopened. And I didn't respond, because boundaries don't need reinforcement through explanation. And days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and the absence became normal. And in that normalcy, I found something unexpected: joy, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, the kind that comes from living in alignment. And just when I thought the reckoning was complete, another opportunity surfaced, one that forced me to choose between visibility and peace, between proving something and protecting something, and the decision I made there would determine not just my future but whether I truly believed the lesson I'd fought so hard to learn, and that choice was coming faster than I realized because the next email changed everything again. The next fracture didn't come from a phone call or an email, it came from a knock, a real physical knock, the kind that makes your body react before your brain does, because some sounds are wired to memory, and when I heard it my stomach tightened the same way it used to when I was a kid, and my father's car pulled into the driveway late at night. I opened the door slowly, and there stood a woman I hadn't seen in almost a year, my mother, not crying, not dramatic, not shaking, just standing there smaller. Then I remembered holding her purse like a shield, and for a second we just looked at each other, two people who shared a lifetime of history and absolutely no roadmap forward. She spoke first, her voice careful, rehearsed. "I won't come," and she said, "I just needed to see you with my own eyes," and that sentence alone told me everything, because when people say things like that, what they mean is they're still trying to decide which version of reality they can live with. I stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind me, not because I was afraid, but because I was finally aware of space and how important it is when power dynamics shift. She looked around at the house, the porch, the roses, the quiet street, and I could see it land on her. This wasn't temporary, this wasn't a phase, this was a life built without her permission. She said, "Your Aunt Helen told me you bought this place," and there was something in her tone, not pride, not warmth, assessment, like she was cataloging evidence. And then she said something that still makes my jaw tighten. "You know, your father says none of this would have happened if you'd just talked to us first." And there it was, the rewrite, the revision, the attempt to roll time backward and recast theft as miscommunication. And I felt something solidify in my chest, not anger, not sadness, clarity. I said calmly, "I did talk to you. I talked for years. Every time I sent money, every time I said yes, every time I swallowed my own needs. That was me talking. You just didn't listen." She pressed her lips together and said, "You didn't have to involve the police." And I replied, "He involved the police when he committed a crime." And the silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was educational, because for the first time she had no script, no fallback, no guilt lever to pull. She tried another angle, softer this time. "He's not doing well, Renee. Probation has been humiliating, people talk." And I said, "Good consequences are supposed to be uncomfortable." And she flinched, like I'd slapped her, not because it was cruel, but because it was true. And then she said the line I think she'd been holding on to since the beginning, "We're still your parents." And I said, "And I'm still your daughter," which is exactly why this hurts, but it doesn't mean I owe you access. And that's when she finally broke, not with tears, but with something else, resentment. "I didn't raise you to be like this," she said. And I answered quietly, "You raised me to survive. I just finally stopped surviving for you." She left without another word, and I stood there longer than necessary, listening to her footsteps fade down the path. And when the door clicked shut behind me, I realized my hands weren't shaking anymore. That used to be my metric, whether I was brave or not. Now the metric was whether I stayed aligned. And I did. Weeks passed, and life settled into a rhythm that felt almost suspiciously calm. Mornings on the porch, coffee cooling in my hands, evenings tending the garden, weekends with friends who knew the whole story and never asked me to minimize it. And then one afternoon, a certified letter arrived from a law office, not my father's, not the bank's, but a civil attorney representing Derek. My brother was suing me for emotional distress and financial interference. I laughed out loud, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. When people lose power, they reach for performance, and lawsuits are just expensive tantrums dressed in legal language. The letter claimed my actions had damaged his reputation, caused him financial loss and emotional trauma. I forwarded it to Marcus, who called me within minutes, amused and irritated. "This won't go anywhere," he said, "but it tells you something, doesn't it?" And I knew exactly what it told me. Derek wasn't sorry, he was embarrassed. And there's a difference. He wanted relief, not accountability. And then Marcus added something else: "They're not done." And that sentence stuck with me, because endings rarely announce themselves. They taper, they echo, they test you again to see if you'll revert. And not 2 weeks later, I found out what he meant. I received a call from a reporter at a local Denver outlet. She said she was working on a piece about elder financial abuse and family disputes, and my name had come up, and my first instinct was to hang up. But then she said something that stopped me. "Your parents are telling people you exploited your father's age and health to frame him." And suddenly, this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about narrative control again, about who gets to be the victim, and I realized silence can be protective, but it can also be weaponized, so I agreed to speak, not to defend myself, but to state facts. I provided court records, bank findings, the forensic report, the plea agreement. I didn't editorialize, I didn't dramatize, I let paper speak. And when the article published, it was clinical, devastating, and irrefutable. The headline read, "Retired banker pleads guilty to identity theft in family case," and my name appeared once not as an accuser, but as the victim, and the comment section exploded. Some people called me brave, others called me heartless, a few said I should have forgiven him privately, and I didn't read every comment, because growth also means knowing when not to consume poison. But I did notice one trend: dozens of people sharing their own stories, parents draining accounts, opening credit cards, co-signing loans that destroyed lives, and that's when I understood something. My story wasn't unique, it was just documented, and that made people uncomfortable, because documentation removes ambiguity, and ambiguity is where abusers hide. Right about here, I want to pause and ask you, where are you watching from? Because if you're still here, this story has touched something, and I want to know how far it's traveled. So drop your city or country in the comments and stay with me, because the next chapter wasn't about them at all. It was about a choice I didn't expect to face, a choice that would prove whether I'd actually internalized everything I'd learned. The nonprofit I'd been volunteering with offered me a full-time position, director-level, good salary, mission-driven work, helping people protect themselves financially. The catch was it required relocating out of Denver, leaving the house, the garden, the porch I'd fought so hard for, and for the first time the sacrifice wasn't for family, it was for purpose. And I froze, because I'd built so much around stability after chaos, and now stability was asking me to move, and I spent nights pacing the living room, weighing fear against growth. And then I realized something profound. The old me would have said yes out of obligation. The new me needed to ask why. And after weeks of reflection, I declined, not because it wasn't worthy, but because I finally trusted myself to know when enough was enough. And that no was a complete sentence, even when opportunity knocks politely. And then, just as I settled into that decision, another letter arrived, this one handwritten from my father, short, shaky, apologetic. He said he was sorry, he said he'd made mistakes, he said he hoped one day we could talk. And I held that letter for a long time, not because I wanted to respond, but because I wanted to understand my own reaction. And what I felt surprised me. I felt sad, not for him, but for the years wasted, the damage done, the person he chose to be. And I realized forgiveness isn't something you grant on demand, it's something that arrives quietly after accountability and repair, neither of which had happened. So I placed the letter in a drawer, not to preserve it, but to release it, and life continued. Birthdays passed, holidays came and went quietly, peacefully, without tension. And then one night, sitting on the porch watching the lights flicker on across the street, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Pride, not pride in survival, not pride in endurance, pride in authorship. This was my life, written by my choices, not reactions. And just when I thought the cycle was finally broken, something unexpected happened, something that forced all of this into a final test. Because healing doesn't end with distance, it ends with discernment. And the next person to challenge that wasn't my family, it was someone new, someone who knew nothing about my past, and yet managed to trigger every old instinct in a single conversation. And that moment would decide whether this story truly had power or whether it had just been a pause. And that's where things take a turn you won't see coming. What came next didn't arrive with sirens or letters or raised voices. It arrived disguised as normal, which in hindsight is always the most dangerous form, because normal lowers your guard. And I was just beginning to believe that my life had finally settled into something predictable when I met Evan at a neighborhood fundraiser, a clean smile, confident posture. Mid-30s, the kind of man who looks like he knows where he's going and expects you to keep up. We talked about the garden, the house, the nonprofit work I'd been doing on weekends, and he listened the way people do when they're deciding where to place you, not dismissive, not impressed, just measuring. And when he asked about my family, I gave the short version, distant, complicated, working on it. And he nodded like he understood, and for a while I believed him, because he didn't push, he didn't pry, he didn't try to rescue me, and that felt like respect until it didn't, because a few weeks in, patterns start to reveal themselves, not in explosions, but in omissions. Evan had opinions about everything, subtle ones framed as concern. You're very independent, he said, once, not accusatory, just curious, like he was observing a rare species. Another time he laughed and said, you don't really need anyone, do you? And something about the way he said need made my spine stiffen, because I'd spent a lifetime being valued only for what I could provide, and here was someone recalibrating that equation again, and I noticed how often he asked about my finances under the guise of admiration. How did you manage to buy a place like this on your own? You must be very disciplined. Do you ever think about investing together? And each question on its own was harmless, but together they formed a familiar shape, and the moment it clicked was the night he casually suggested I add his name to the emergency contact forms for the house utilities, just in case something happens to you. The words echoed like a bad remix of an old song, and I felt my body react before my brain could soften it. My chest tightened, my jaw locked, and I smiled politely while my internal alarms went off, and I said, I'll think about it, and he didn't push. But later that night, lying awake staring at the ceiling, I realized something terrifying. I didn't feel unsafe because he was aggressive. I felt unsafe because he was reasonable, because he was echoing the same language my parents used to justify access, and I understood then that healing isn't about avoiding monsters, it's about recognizing masks, and I decided to test something small. The next day, over coffee, I mentioned casually that I'd changed my will and set up a trust for future assets, just basic planning, and his reaction was immediate, not explosive, just slightly off. A pause too long, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Oh, he said, that seems a little extreme, don't you think, for someone your age? And there it was, the minimization, the suggestion that preparedness was paranoia, and I felt a strange calm settle over me because clarity is quiet, and I said maybe, but it makes me feel secure, and he shrugged, but the energy shifted, and in the weeks that followed, he became subtly irritated by my boundaries, by my unwillingness to merge, to blur, to compromise control, and one evening after dinner, he finally said it out loud, I just feel like you don't trust people, and I met his gaze steady and replied, I trust patterns, and the pattern here is that you want access before you've earned it. And he laughed sharply, called me guarded, called me damaged, and for the first time I didn't argue, I didn't defend, I didn't explain, I simply said this isn't working, and stood up, and the look on his face was pure shock, not heartbreak, not anger, disbelief that he didn't get to negotiate, and that moment mattered more than any court victory, because it proved the work had stuck. I could walk away without justification, without guilt, without collapsing. And halfway through this, I want to pause and ask you, where are you watching from? Because if you've ever felt that shift, that internal click when something finally makes sense, I want to know you're not alone. So drop your city or country in the comments and stay with me, because the next layer wasn't about romance or family, it was about legacy, not the financial kind, the psychological one. I started speaking publicly at small workshops about financial boundaries and family systems, sharing pieces of my story, anonymized but real, and after one talk a woman approached me shaking, told me her mother had drained her retirement fund, and she was too ashamed to tell anyone, and I saw myself in her eyes 8 years ago, and I realized something that broke me open. This cycle doesn't survive exposure, and I leaned into that work, more teaching, not preaching, giving people language for what they felt but couldn't name, and then the emails started, not hate mail, not praise, confessions, people trusting me with their secrets, and each one reinforced the same truth: betrayal thrives in silence and power hates witnesses. And then one afternoon I received a message I never expected from my father's probation officer, requesting a victim impact statement for a review hearing. I hadn't planned to engage further, but I agreed, because closure isn't always about peace, sometimes it's about punctuation, and I wrote, plainly, not cruelly, not emotionally, just facts. How the theft had impacted my life, my trust, my mental health, my ability to form relationships. And when I read it aloud in that sterile room, my father sat across from me, smaller, older, eyes downcast. And for the first time, I didn't feel anything, not pity, not rage, just distance. And when it was over, the officer thanked me, and my father tried to speak. But I stood up and left, because some conversations are closed chapters, not cliffhangers. And driving home that day, windows down, sun on my face, I realize something else. The story people tell about forgiveness is incomplete. Forgiveness without accountability is permission. And I had given enough permissions in my life, and the house felt different that night, warmer, not because anything had changed physically, but because I was fully inside it now, not waiting for the other shoe, not bracing for intrusion. And I slept deeply and woke up knowing the hardest part was behind me and the most important part ahead, because when you stop being the family scapegoat or the fixer or the ATM, you create a vacuum, and life rushes in to fill it with opportunity, with connection, with peace, but also with one final test, a decision that would define not who I was running from, but who I was running toward. And that decision came wrapped in an invitation that looked generous, sounded flattering, and required one thing I'd spent years reclaiming, and whether I said yes or no would determine if this story truly ended in freedom or just another variation of compromise. And that moment is coming next. The invitation arrived in an email that looked harmless, subject line opportunity to collaborate, sender name familiar enough to lower suspicion, and when I opened it, I had to sit down because it was from a regional housing nonprofit, one I'd volunteered with twice, offering me a paid advisory role, something legitimate, respected, visible, the kind of position people point to and say she's made it. They wanted my data background, my advocacy work, my lived experience navigating financial abuse and systemic blind spots. It was flattering, validating, and for a moment intoxicating, because this wasn't survival money, this was purpose money, and the proposal outlined speaking engagements, policy recommendations, even a small team under me. And as I read through it, I felt that old spark, the one that lights up when you realize you could build something that matters. But buried halfway down the page was a line that stopped me cold. Compensation structure includes shared fiscal oversight with executive director pending trust review. And there it was again, dressed up in professional language. The request for access, the expectation of shared control justified by trust, and I stared at that sentence longer than I should have, because this time the threat wasn't obvious, it was institutional, respectable, and that made it harder, because walking away from something harmful that looks like love is one thing, walking away from something harmful that looks like opportunity feels like sabotage, and I spent 3 days going back and forth, rationalizing, minimizing, telling myself I was being paranoid. Telling myself not everyone is like my parents, not every shared account is a trap. And then I did something different. I didn't ask for reassurance, I asked for documentation. I replied politely, requesting clarification on fiscal oversight roles, legal authority, and exit clauses. And the response came back evasive, softened, we can discuss later. Trust builds over time, you'll see. And that sentence sent a chill through me, because trust doesn't build in the absence of clarity, it builds on it. And I realized this was the final exam, not imposed by fate, but by growth. Could I choose myself even when the cost wasn't pain but potential? And I declined, not dramatically, not angrily, just clearly thanked them for the offer, explained my boundaries, and wished them well. And the silence that followed wasn't punishment, it was peace. And that's when I knew I was free, not because no one could hurt me anymore, but because I would never again trade access to myself for belonging. And right here, I want to pause. Because if you're still listening this far into the story, it tells me something about you too. So tell me, where are you watching from? What city, what country, what corner of the world are you sitting in while hearing this? Because stories like this land differently depending on where you are. And I read every single comment. And after that decision, something shifted quietly. Doors didn't slam, they opened differently. Invitations became more precise, relationships more reciprocal, and I began to understand that the work I'd done wasn't just about recovering money or exposing a crime. It was about recalibrating my internal compass so that when manipulation showed up, even in a suit, even with a smile, I could recognize it without doubting myself. And then one afternoon, months later, I received a message that felt like the universe tying a knot. Aunt Helen had passed away peacefully in her sleep, and grief hit me in waves, because she had been my witness, my anchor, my proof that sanity can survive in toxic systems. And at the reading of her will, something unexpected happened. She had left me a modest inheritance, nothing extravagant but meaningful, not because of the amount but because of the note attached. You showed me what courage looks like. Spend this on something that grows. And I cried harder over that sentence than I had over anything else, because for the first time, inheritance meant affirmation, not control. And I used part of that money to establish a small grant fund for women escaping financial abuse, quietly, efficiently, no publicity, no fanfare, just support. And the first recipient emailed me weeks later saying she'd opened her own account for the first time in her life, and that message felt better than any revenge ever could. And as the year closed, I stood in my garden watching the seasons change, realizing the tomatoes had come and gone, the roses pruned back, waiting for spring. And I thought about cycles, how abuse repeats, how healing repeats, how patterns either trap us or teach us. And the story people want is the dramatic ending, the arrest, the confrontation, the downfall. But the real ending, the one that matters, is quieter. It's the moment you stop rehearsing explanations for people who never intended to understand. It's the moment you realize peace doesn't announce itself, it settles in slowly, like light through a window you forgot was open. And I know there's one more question hanging in the air, the one people Always ask, do you ever miss them? And the honest answer is I. Miss the idea of what could have been, not the reality of what was, and that difference matters because nostalgia can trick you into reopening doors that were closed for a reason. And as I sit here now writing this from the same porch where I once cried with relief, I can say this with certainty: choosing yourself will cost you illusions, but it will give you your life. And the next chapter isn't about them at all. It's about the moment when someone else tried to cross a line, assuming my silence was permanent, and discovered that boundaries once learned are never forgotten. And that moment is where the story truly sharpens, and you'll want to hear it because it proves something essential: that healing isn't passive, it's protective. And once you know how to protect yourself, you change the outcome, not just for you, but for everyone watching and learning how to do the same. I didn't think the final reckoning would come quietly, but that's exactly how it arrived: not with sirens or courtrooms or shouting matches, but with an envelope slipped under my front door one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the kind of envelope that looks official enough to make your stomach tighten before you even pick it up. Return address, unfamiliar handwriting, careful, controlled. When I opened it, I had to read the first line 3 times before it made sense. Richard Chapman has requested a restorative mediation session to discuss closure, accountability, and possible reconciliation, and I laughed, not a laugh of humor, but the kind that escapes when your body recognizes irony faster than your brain. Because even now, even after the arrest, the plea deal, the restitution, the public collapse of the story they had curated for decades, my father still wanted the final frame. He wanted to rewrite the ending in a way that centered him as reflective, evolved, misunderstood. The letter went on about healing journeys and family legacy and personal growth, buzzwords strung together like a corporate apology email, and at the bottom his signature, shaky but unmistakable. And for a long moment, I just sat there on my living room floor, holding the paper, thinking about how power adapts when it can no longer dominate, it negotiates. And I want to be very clear here, because this is where people get confused. Accountability does not ask for comfort, it accepts consequence. Reconciliation does not begin with requests, it begins with remorse. And what my father wanted was absolution without admission, a clean slate without cleaning the mess. And for a brief, dangerous second, the old programming flared, the part of me trained to smooth things over, to make space, to be reasonable, to consider his feelings. And then I stood up, walked to the kitchen, and tore the letter in half, not dramatically, not angrily, just decisively, and dropped it into the trash. Because some doors don't need answers, they need locks. And as the days passed, something unexpected happened. The story stopped feeling heavy, it started feeling complete, like a book you finally close. Not because you've forgotten the plot, but because you no longer need to reread it to understand yourself. And around that same time, I was invited to speak at a local workshop on financial autonomy for women, hosted in a community center in Aurora, Colorado. Not glamorous, not paid, just folding chairs and coffee and paper cups. And I almost declined because visibility still felt vulnerable. But I went, and I told my story, stripped of names and drama, focused on patterns, the slow erosion, the disguised dependency, the way love gets weaponized through access and control. And after the session, a woman about my mother's age approached me, eyes red, hands shaking, and she said, "I thought it was just my family. I thought I was crazy." And that sentence right there, that was the moment everything locked into place, because the value of what I went through wasn't the money recovered or the house purchased, it was the clarity earned and shared. And right here, I want to pause again, because if you're still with me this deep into the story, I want to know, where are you watching from? What city, what country, what time zone? Because this moment, this realization that harm often hides inside normalcy, it hits differently depending on where you're sitting in the world. And I read every comment. And as the months unfolded, my life continued, not dramatically, but deliberately. Routines strengthened, friendships deepened, work flourished, and the absence of chaos created space for things I'd never prioritized, like rest, joy, even boredom, which turned out to be a luxury. And then one evening, my phone buzzed with a number I hadn't seen in months, Derek, and I stared at it longer than I should have before letting it go to voicemail. And his message was short, stripped of excuses, stripped of requests. Just this: "I'm in therapy. Now I finally understand some things. I'm sorry." And that was it. No ask, no pressure, no expectation. And for the first time, his words didn't trigger anger or obligation. They landed and stayed there quietly. And I realized something else: forgiveness doesn't always mean re-entry. Sometimes it just means release. And I didn't call back, not because I was punishing him, but because my healing didn't require his progress. And I hope that distinction matters to anyone listening who feels stuck waiting for someone else to change before they can move on. You don't need closure from the person who hurt you to close the chapter yourself. And as the year turned and winter settled over Littleton, I found myself Standing at the edge of my garden one cold morning watching frost trace patterns on the soil thinking about inheritance again, not money, not property, but habits, beliefs, reflexes, the things passed down silently, and I made a decision right there to be intentional about what ends with me, the guilt reflex, the fear of saying no, the belief that love must be earned through sacrifice, those don't get passed on, and when friends asked if I regret it, involving the police, if I wished I'd handled it privately, I answered, honestly, privacy protects patterns, accountability breaks them, and that's a lesson worth teaching even when it costs you comfort. And now as I sit here writing this, the sun setting over a life that finally feels like mine, I want to leave you with this. If you've been the reliable one, the quiet one, the one who gives and gives, and wonders why you're always empty, it's not because you lack strength, it's because your strength has been exploited, and strength without boundaries isn't virtue. It's vulnerability, and you are allowed to protect what you build. You are allowed to say no even to family, especially to family when they confuse access with entitlement. And if this story stirred something in you, if it mirrored a fear or a memory or a choice you've been avoiding, I want you to comment, tell me your experience, tell me where you're watching from, tell me what boundary you know you need to set, because stories like this don't end when the video ends, they continue in the decisions we make after. And if you're wondering what came next for me, the moment when someone new tried to test those boundaries in a way I never expected, that's the story waiting in the next video, because once you learn how to say no, your life gets quieter, but the challenges get smarter, and that's where the real transformation begins.